And so it's really topical to have my friend Fiona, who is not only the author of the book on Putin, and I say that having written a book on Putin, your book is better, Fiona, and by a long way, and particularly read the footnotes in the Putin book because they are extremely informative. But also you survived the Trump White House and you made a huge sacrifice, I think, going into the Trump White House. And many people said, what on earth are you doing going to work for that appalling man? And it was really because he was so appalling that you were so important there. And when we said in the introduction, you were the voice of reason and conscience, you're one of the pegs that held down the tent of American constitutional order and decency at a time when a very strong wind was blowing it away. So it's not only Americans who are grateful to you for that. And then there's this book, Nothing for You Here, which both tells the story of your odyssey in and out of the White House and up to Capitol Hill and back again, but also has a much bigger narrative arc, which is the story of how you moved from Bishop Auckland to through the British higher education system to North America, and memorably were asked by, was it Tony Blair, how did you get here? And I think you replied, I came by bike. Is that right?
I came on a plane.
You came on a plane, yes. But the most startling thing I find in your book is the story of how America, a foreign country, was able to offer you a career ladder that you wouldn't have had in this country. And I think everybody in Britain who reads your book should feel ashamed and embarrassed by the fact that the obstacles that were put in your way were rungs on the ladder when you crossed the Atlantic. So I want to stop talking now and ask you some questions. And first of all, I want you to just give us a potted summary of the. This is being live streamed, by the way.
Oh, is it? Okay. I'll have to be careful.
Yeah. Let's start off at the beginning. How did you get interested in Russia?
Well, look, it was all about timing. First of all, I just want to say how great it is to be here and actually to see many friends as well as new friends that I've just made standing around the edges, and at such a momentous time. I mean, I don't think any of us could have foreseen where we would be today, especially our friends from Ukraine. I mean, what a terrible situation. Although, you know, as we say, Cassandra is the patron saint of analysts, like Ed and I, and unfortunately we did, many people here also saw the trajectory that we're on, but we couldn't have exactly predicted entirely how it would turn out. And I feel in many respects, it gets back to what the question you just asked me, we've gone full circle. Because I got interested in studying Russian in 1983. And there are a few people around here, got a little bit of grey hair like I do, who might remember 1983. And November 1983, the war scare, against the backdrop of the Euro missile crisis. There's some people here who it was, you know, well, this is your grandparents, you know, era. And you're thinking, 1983? There's some, you know, occasionally good music that came out of that period. There's been an 80s revival. But what happened in November 1983 that was such a big deal? Well, it was actually, as we now know, from the opening up of what was previously classified documentation, both in the UK and the United States, that we really were on the verge of a nuclear exchange. This was Europe's version of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the whole conflict over the stationing of new nuclear weapons, SS-20s on the part of the Soviet Union, and Pershing missiles on the part of the United States, on top of other nuclear missiles that already existed. These were intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe. And basically, the Soviet Union was putting Europe, Western Europe, and especially the United Kingdom, in jeopardy, and threatening a nuclear strike that would basically take out life as we know it right here. And it turned out that Queen Elizabeth II had even prepared a speech for her fellow Britons, bemoaning the fact that we were all in a fallout shelter or living through nuclear winter and nuclear Armageddon. I was about to do my A-levels at the time. I remember sitting around in class and saying, well, what's the point? We're all going to die in, you know, nuclear winter. And, you know, we would have you know, basically instructions sent out to us about what to do if you heard an air raid siren. Some of you might remember this. And it wasn't duck and cover like the Americans have, where they get under the school desk. We were told to look for a ditch if we were outside and lie in it. I could think to myself, well, for how long? I mean, particularly if it's nuclear winter, how long? What kind of ditch? I mean, is there any specification? Or to find, you know, a room, you know, that didn't have any windows. And I lived in a little semi-detached in a, you know, 1960s housing, development up in the northeast of England. And the only room that we had, with no windows, was the cupboard under the stairs. And it was smaller than Harry Potter's. And I thought, how are we all going to get in? My dad said, we'll just get some very thick curtains and we'll pull them closed and just, ride it out. So these are the kinds of ridiculous things that everybody was thinking about. And I basically thought, well, this doesn't seem very practical. Maybe I should study Russian. And I had a great uncle who had basically been in World War II in the Merchant Marine. And he basically one day said to my father, your Fiona's good at languages. I'd been studying French and German at school. And he said, I don't understand how the Russians have gone from being our wartime allies to wanting to bloody well blow us up. Maybe she should go and study Russian and figure it out. So that was kind of my mission, and I thought, well, why not? I should do that. Nobody told me I couldn't. And I thought, well, maybe I could become an interpreter for some arms control negotiations. And then as weird fate would have it, I ended up getting a scholarship to go to study in the Soviet Union in 1987, 1988, just as Gorbachev and Reagan sat down and signed the INF Treaty, bringing an end to basically 10 years of the Euro missile crisis and all these fears that generated interest in Russia and all the kind of fears that many of us lived with. And now we've come full circle back again, because here we have Vladimir Putin saber-rattling, not just with intermediate nuclear missiles, Iskanders, that may be nuclear tipped in somewhere like Kaliningrad, but also threatening Ukraine with perhaps the use of a battlefield nuclear weapon.
And in a way, that's much more troubling than either the Cuban Missile Crisis or the 1983, because those were basically risks of nuclear war because of a misunderstanding.
Correct.
Whereas
absolutely.
Even Stalin, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, none of them actually tried to use nuclear weapons as a negotiating lever to say, give us what we want politically, otherwise we'll nuke you. So this is a completely new era.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that the roots of what we have now are in a kind of misunderstanding about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I want to just ask you a little bit about the early 90s, because we saw the planned economy collapse, and we saw the one-party state collapse. And I think many people thought, well, that's the end of also the Soviet Empire. It's all collapsing together. And it seems to me that what actually happened was that the political and economic system collapsed, but the imperial thinking didn't. And that's what's now, boosted by oil wealth and Putin's personality and other things, has come back to bite us, and particularly bite the Ukrainians.
That's spot on. We've got...
So we won't disagree.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing, but I'll elaborate on it a bit, because look, imperial thinking is not unknown standing in these kind of hallowed halls. At least not in this building, but next door just a little bit. And in the United States as well, there is certainly, the kind of thinking of the United States empire. The United States has a really hard time explaining to itself, kind of that actually had its own imperial tendencies. But Putin and Russia have taken it to a completely different dimension. What we are seeing in Ukraine today is really a post-colonial, post-imperial land grab, an effort to bring the empire back. And Putin hasn't made any secret of it, in fact. So for anybody who doubts it, just go and look at what Putin's writing about. Now, we all know that Putin said that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think this gets to your point, Ed. That was, for all of us then, a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of what he was talking about. We thought he thought about the Soviet state. I'm constantly being asked, so is he trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union? No, he's not. He was never really a member of the Communist Party, although one of his grandfathers was Stalin's cook. That was a bit of a dangerous job anyway, particularly if you didn't like the borscht or something. But they weren't really effective in the communist system. His family were not part of the communist hierarchy, part of the nomenclatura. For Putin, his whole image of Russia is built on the idea of Russia as a great imperial power, as a great power. And for Russia to be great, it needs its borderlands. And of course, as we all know, Ukraine, the very word itself means on the borderlands. I'm from the borderlands in the northeast of England. Lots of walls were built, kind of basically demarcating us off from the Scots and the Picts and all the people a little bit further north. And those borderlands and that kind of idea of a sort of Russian imperium is the motivating factor for somebody like Vladimir Putin. He's kind of coming directly out of a much deeper, I think, historical trend in Russian political thought. In fact, I mean, if you read some of the essays that Putin has written, they seem very reminiscent, things that Russian nationalist thinkers were actually writing in the 1900s, in the late Romanov period. There's nothing new in this. And Putin actually, if you pushed him, would probably say that the other great catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Russian Empire. And in many respects, he's trying, as he often says, and he said this even around this invasion, when he basically went on a tear about Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, and then the creation of a Ukraine, of a separate entity of Ukraine as a republic in the Soviet Union, that Lenin and the Bolsheviks made mistakes. They brought down the Russian Empire. They severed away Russian lands. And he still thinks today of Ukrainians and Belarusians as being Russians in the old imperial sense of white Russians and little Russians. And he's laid it all out for us in multiple essays. So he's exactly thinking along these lines.
Yes, because the Tsar used to be called the Tsar of, his formal title was the Tsar of all the Russias, wasn't it?
That's right, all the Russias.
Yeah. You had an absolute ringside seat, both in your think tank career, but then in government. I think you must be almost the only person who did Russia in both the Obama and the Trump administrations. I certainly can't think of
And in the Bush administration.
And in Bush,
as
yes.
Well, yeah.
So you've had this kind of roller coaster of different approaches. We had the look into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. We had the Obama reset, which I'm sure you've got some views on, and then the Trump, why can't we all be friends approach. And I'm wondering, when you look back at those years, what was there a particular thing you think, gosh, that would be one thing we really should have done differently? Was there any kind of fulcrum where we did something dramatically wrong? My candidate would be the 2008 Bucharest summit, which I think where we got the worst of all worlds.
That was kind of one of the issues that I would have focused on. But look, the other thing was the reset was framed by the Dmitry Medvedev presidency. I mean, people have forgotten that Dmitry Medvedev was actually president of Russia for a while, for 4 years.
Nominally.
Nominally, exactly. And Putin was always there at his shoulder, just, kind of watching over and seeing what he was doing at all times. And then, Dmitry Medvedev has had probably the strangest resume of anyone there, because then he, kind of disappears off to be prime minister and people forget he's there. And he's been on the Security Council, and he suddenly kind of gets chucked out at different points to make statements as a kind of a mouthpiece for Putin, but it's not really clear what his role is. And that was part of the mistake that we made, sort of losing a sense of the continuity in the system, of the central role that Putin himself was playing in all of this. And not really understanding the thinking of Putin and many of the people around him, which, fed into some of this historical imperial thinking. Because, at the very beginning of the Putin presidency, of course, a lot of people saw a much more pragmatic Putin. I wouldn't actually say that it was inevitable, to be honest, to get to this particular point. But there are certain things that happen along the way. As you mentioned, the Bucharest summit and offering an open door to Ukraine and Georgia without a real membership action plan, a real perspective on it, thinking about the security guarantees might have been part of it. Misunderstanding the way that Putin was thinking about NATO. He thought that NATO was really an affront, an insult to Russia. It's really kind of more about giving everybody a different perspective than it is really about the military terms of this. It's kind of suggesting a different imperial context or a different framework for countries that he thinks belong to Russia. And there's also in kind of our ways of thinking about Putin and Russia and the people around him of not really kind of fully understanding the way that they see the world. Remember that Angela Merkel said Putin lives in his own world, and people thought, well, that means that he's somewhat deranged. Of course not. No, it just means that he has a completely different perspective. And we've actually thought that the Russians were converging with us, when really there was a kind of a negative convergence in some of the ways that we were doing business with Russia in particular. That was, of course, the feature of your book on the new Cold War, which is about the kind of the corruption and the way that we kind of were running after Russian money and a kind of assuming that because Russians wanted to live here in London, the oligarchs and the kind of the business class, that they were becoming more like us, and not really realizing that they were still very much the servants of the state, managing assets for the state, and thinking about Russia as a separate society, separate civilization, and separate entity.
Yeah, I think the two, I slightly disagree with you on Putin, I think, because I thought he was bad from the very beginning. And to me, having a former KGB guy being made first prime minister and then president of Russia and greeted with acclamation was as alarming as it would be to have a former Gestapo or SS officer taking over Germany. And so I was probably rather in the extreme minority of Moscow correspondents in the late 90s, early noughties, who was very critical of Putin. But I think this other point is absolutely central, that we thought Russia was becoming more Western because superficially it looked a bit, well, Moscow was looking more and more like a Western city, and other big Russian cities were looking more Western. They had McDonald's and all this sort of thing. And I think what we missed was the way in which the kleptocracy was actually doing a different kind of convergence. It was corrupting our political class. First of all, with the Caviar Express in Moscow, and then with the bankers and lawyers, accountants and grifters and fixers and PR people and others in Western countries, particularly here in London, who were basically on the Russian payroll. And that created a kind of political weight, which has distorted our decision-making, and was one of the reasons, I think, why we were so slow to realise how sinister and dangerous Putin really was.
Well, this kind of gets into that, initial point that you said, because look, we also mentioned in the earlier part of the questions about the fact that in many respects, the relationship with the Soviet Union was a bit more stable, including on the nuclear front, because there were checks and balances. There was a party, there was a Politburo, there were systems and there were rules. And when Putin comes in, all of those are kind of thrown out the window. And it's, you can take the guy out of the KGB, but you can't take the KGB out of the guy. He becomes the person who's basically risen to power through the dark corridors, and there's no one to check and balance him because of the nature of the Russian political system. The president is at the apex, this vertical of power. There's no party system to anchor him. The parliament isn't anything other than a rubber stamp. And the only thing that is any kind of check beyond the Russian constitution, which really gives the president immense powers, is the popularity, the kind of having to periodically take his position to be voted upon by the people, to be acclaimed, in other words, and to be given kind of popularity. And the fact that he is the kind of person that he is, who his whole business was manipulating people, as he said, working with people, trying to kind of figure out how you turn somebody into an asset and how you try to get your own way. The fact that there's no check and balance in their system is bad enough. But then we didn't enforce our own checks and balances. And when I say that I don't think it was necessarily inevitable where we got to today, we could have done a lot more to stop this. In other words, we could have pushed back. We could have made it much more difficult for the Russians to sue people like Catherine Belton, for example, for the FT when she wrote Putin's People, or to get titles and kind of basically kind of take over control of this town financially and things like that. And we could have pushed back when they did things, made big mistakes that were made. For example, when Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium, which would come down like a ton of bricks. Same with Skripal. I mean, actually, we did start to react. But I mean, I was in the NSC at the time making phone calls to Europeans saying, look, what if this happened in X town, Salisbury equivalent, in York country? And there was enough Novichok in the vial to basically kill 4,000 people. And remember, a British citizen, Dawn Sturgis, died. And I said, keep saying her name, because the Russians did kill someone. This was not a casualty-free effort. It was a brazen assassination attempt. They did not care. We should, each time that something like that happened, we did come down hard after MH17, but there was just too much of this is just a flash in the pan. Same after Georgia, when the Russians invaded Georgia. The Russians anticipated that we would do something more than we did. They were really very nervous. I mean, I know this, I was in the National Intelligence Council at the time. They were waiting for us to respond, and we didn't really. And so every time Putin thinks he can get away with doing more. And that's how we end up to this point, because we could have created constraints. We could have pushed back. I mean, you were speaking out about this for years. I mean, going back to the book and, much earlier, many people have been. And people have been turning, basically a blind eye or a deaf ear to this. The Germans, I mean, how long has the United States been basically haranguing the Germans about energy pipelines? Since the 60s, 70s and 80s, when they first came into place. All of the debate about Nord Stream 2, well, there was Nord Stream 1 that people have forgotten about.
And before there was Yamal.
And before there was Yamal, and then Druzhba, and all of the other pipelines. And we said it wasn't a great idea at the time. And we're now with the Schadenfreude basically came around how many decades too late, and the Germans are waking up to this. So we made a lot of mistakes. It's not just about NATO. It's just about we needed to enforce our own rules. And instead of, that's what I meant about convergence. Instead of convergence in a positive way, it ended up being a negative way, because in the pursuit of billions, or the pursuit of economic and material interests, we threw our rule book out the window.
And just in parenthesis, yeah, I should say that there is someone in the audience who's written literally the book on Germany's Russia
John
problem.
Love, yeah, I had to recommend
John, stand up a moment. Hello.
Yeah, exactly.
Please buy John's book as well. It's really, really important.
Tells the whole story.
Yeah.
We'll get that out.
And what's so infuriating about this, and it really makes me just so angry I can hardly speak, is that we made the mistakes, and the Ukrainians are paying with their lives. And this isn't just some kind of academic thing about, well, maybe we should have handled our relations with Brazil a bit differently, or did we miss an opportunity in Africa, or why can't we get on better with France? This is the most enormous geopolitical toll in human terms of anything that's happened in our lifetime. I guess this probably, my mother remembers the outbreak of war. I'm not sure there's anyone in the room who's the same age as my mother. When I say the outbreak of war, I mean the Second World War. But this is the most absolutely convulsively destructive event, and it's going to have consequences that will shape Europe and the world for the rest of our lives in terms of the suffering and the trauma and the polarization and all the awful byproducts of it. And it happened because we weren't paying attention, because we were ignorant and naive and complacent and most of all greedy.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think we have to, also say that, the wars in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and, elsewhere have been, very jarring. And also there is a tie to this because the Russians watched how we behaved there. So basically, Putin is also saying, well, look, what about the United States in Iraq the second time around, not 1990, where there was actually an international frame for this. But if the United States can get away with that, why can't we? And so, and again, our own inability to kind of articulate, and fess up to our own mistakes has also contributed to this, because Putin is now basically telling the rest of the world there's nothing to look at here in Ukraine. Ukraine is suffering again because of many other mistakes that we have made, because he's telling the world that this is a proxy war, that this is just like during the Cold War, that this is Vietnam, or that this is Korea, which it absolutely isn't. He's basically saying, well, the US has done things like this. What about the United States all the time? Or what about Britain? Or what about other countries in the past? And this is in itself is a major problem, because Ukraine has nothing to do with any of this. This is purely and simple a post-colonial, post-imperial land grab, but Putin trying to take this back again, as if the United Kingdom went back into Ireland because we couldn't resolve the issues and identity crises with Northern Ireland, or if the United States invaded Canada because of the English speakers were being repressed by those funny French people. This is basically. We have to explain what actually is happening here. And the point, though, that you've made about this being an international conventional with global implications is spot on. Because the dimensions of what's happening in Ukraine, we're going to be feeling these reverberations for a very long time. And I've made this analogy of Putin being like the four horsemen of the apocalypse recently. I was reminded of this thinking, I saw a picture of him when he's bare-chested on horseback in Siberia somewhere, and I thought, yeah, this is great. He's brought in conquest with war at the time of pestilence, and he's bringing about famine as well as death, because Ukraine has remained, since the 1900s, the breadbasket of Europe. And so many places in Africa, this is the global dimension that we haven't completely felt, are 100% dependent on grain and food supplies, commodities coming out of Ukraine. The ports, Mariupol being completely level. This isn't just, kind of a story that we're going to be talking about later. One of the great grain ports of the Black Sea. The basic explosion in the refinery and the storage tanks in Odessa. That is the fuel for ships, basically bringing again commodities out of Ukraine. There is no growing season now in Ukraine in the spring. They should already be planting. But instead they've got basically landmines and cluster bombs, and their farmers are trying to use their tractors to pull Russian tanks off the road. So this is going to have a knock-on effect in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Eritrea, and all of the places that are already suffering. And this also has to be explained, to other parts of the world as well, that this is going to have an impact on you. And not because of anything the Ukrainians have done, and not about what the United States did in Iraq or anything else. This is what Russia is doing right now. This is not the Cold War. This is a proxy. This is not a proxy war. And Putin is basically creating a problem here that is going to have global consequences.
And yes, it's very odd how little condemnation there's been of Russia outside the sort of core West. And it's really alarming when you look at the votes in the UN, how little support the Ukrainian cause has in so much of Africa, so much of Asia, so much of Latin America. And I feel that we tend to phrase this or shape it in sort of terms of an East-West conflict, right, where we assume the West is good, and therefore people should be supporting Ukraine because this is an attack on the West. And I think that's totally misconceived when it comes to most of the rest of the world, which doesn't think that the West is particularly good. They think of Iraq and Afghanistan, and perhaps also of the financial crisis, which has, to some extent, dented our reputation for competence when it comes to financial things. And so I'm advising the Ukrainians to frame this much more in the terms that you've put it, of being a colonial land grab, which would be very familiar, rather than in the sort of more reductive East-West sense.
Yeah, I mean, sadly for Ukraine, they're going to have to get out there on the global stage. I mean, they've got enough on their hands at the moment to make that case, because they do need the support of the rest of the world. There's another element here, and it gets back to why you and I started studying Russian, and back to the Euro missile crisis again, because Putin is pulling us across a nuclear threshold, as you said earlier. That, in the days of the Soviet Union, nobody was threatening, well, I'm going to nuke you if you don't do this, which Putin is explicitly saying, to intimidate us, to get us to step back, and is signalling very clearly to the rest of the world that he's going after Ukraine. He's doing what he's doing because he has nuclear weapons and because he's a former nuclear superpower. And of course, for a brief period, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were also nuclear superpowers. Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they inherited strategic nuclear arsenal, and we pushed them, the United Kingdom and the United States, pushed them to give this up for good reasons in the early 1990s, and then we gave them assurances that they would be safe from any kind of predation and pressure. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, of course, there were no assurances. There were no guarantees. And the message to the rest of the world is, get a nuclear weapon quickly.
And what's so infuriating about this is that Budapest Memorandum was also signed by Russia, and it didn't have any footnotes in it saying this does not apply if you have a government we don't like, which is basically Putin's...
Yeah, Putin basically said everything has changed now, meaning, I don't like the current set of circumstances.
I know we hate making forecasts, particularly about the future, but if we look at where we are now, I see only horrible options, really. Defeat for Ukraine would be horrible. Someone needs to press a button to make idle TV standby, turn off on that. Ukraine's defeat would be awful. A stalemate of more of what we've got at the moment will mean more misery, more destabilizing flows of refugees, more awfulness. But defeat for Russia, which I guess we all kind of wish for, seems to me to be very alarming as well, because of this threat of escalation. What does Putin do if he faces a 1917-style military rot? Some people here may have seen the film Dr. Zhivago. There's a very good scene in that where the soldiers shoot their officers. I hope Putin has watched it with Russian subtitles. That if he seriously starts losing, either because of Ukrainian force of arms, because of his decay, he's made it very clear he'll escalate. How worried should we be by this? Is escalation just a bogeyman that we should stare down? Is there something that we could do to rebuild our escalation ladder? Should we be pumping far more arms into Ukraine far more quickly? How do you see the likely courses of action and possibilities?
Well, look, this isn't a bogeyman. Putin is definitely thinking through all of these things. And again, remember, during the Soviet period, the Soviet Union had a pretty impressive and robust arsenal of all kinds of nuclear weapons and biological and chemical weapons as well. And it was part of their doctrine to use them under certain circumstances, but usually when there was an existential threat that they faced. And Putin is the kind of person, if he has an instrument, he wants to figure out how we can use it. Polonium, Novichok, I mean, all the kinds of things that, it wouldn't even occur to us to use, because he's doing it for effect. Why did he poison Litvinenko and basically Skripal and Navalny and all the other assassinations have taken place? He basically just said to Russian opposition, anybody who's thinking of challenging him, I can get you no matter where. So he's already deployed for all of us, rhetorically, nuclear weapons to intimidate us, to get us to step back and have everybody rushing, for basically selling out Ukraine. So we have to bear in mind just exactly what he is doing here. And this is why, again, we need a really robust international diplomatic response to basically say, look, Putin is putting the non-proliferation treaty out of the window. We were supposed to have a review conference for the non-proliferation treaty in August. It's already been suspended twice because of COVID and all the kinds of other things that are happening here. And this is opening literally the Pandora's box of the nuclear frame again. We're going way beyond anywhere that we could even have imagined during the Cold War, because we were the nuclear superpowers. We had the P5. We've gone way beyond the P5 now from the United Nations in terms of the nuclear powers. We have Pakistan and India. We've got countries we're not supposed to talk about that we know have, nuclear weapons or, basically programs. We have, of course, North Korea and Iran that we've been engaging with that have tried to basically embark on their own nuclear blackmail. Putin has joined that kind of, wonderful company of countries. And we have to really push back against this. So we have to engage with China and with other countries more broadly, because this is deeply destabilizing. So I think this is why you see Japan and South Korea and other countries kind of responding so strongly to this as well. So I think the first thing that we have to do is to keep pushing on this international diplomacy and find a way of articulating to others why this is so dangerous, why this really is of global concern. Do the Emirates, for example, want to be engaged in a nuclear arms race with all of their neighbours? How will Iran feel about Saudi Arabia, for example, acquiring a nuclear weapon? This is the path that we're heading on right now, because everyone's looking at this and thinking the writing is very clear here on the wall. Get yourself a nuclear weapon, because that's the way that you can prevail in any kind of political, basically confrontation and disagreement with your neighbours. And so this is what we really have to push about here, as well as then making that case that Ukraine is basically defending its sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence for all of the other countries out there that could be predated upon by a larger neighbour. So it's not just about giving Ukraine more weapons and helping them to basically push and blunt the effect of the Russian invasion. It's how we get the rest of the world to push back against this. And it's kind of reducing the ability of the Russians to prosecute the war, and including the information war, which they've been extraordinarily good at, because, as we've all said, they've already got the rest of the world convinced that this is a proxy war and the Ukrainians are somehow collateral damage and it's all about NATO or it's all about the West, or, this is just a kind of another playing out of the sins of the old imperial powers again.
It is interesting, this information stuff. I've been very sceptical about the idea of information warfare being a thing on its own. It seems to me it's almost always something that is part of other influence operations. And I think you're absolutely right that Russian propaganda's worked in large chunks of the world, but it's also dramatically not worked in places where it used to.
Like here. I mean, Ben Wallace, I actually have to give credit to the Defence Secretary. I mean, I was just really pleased when I saw his essay. Just, the rest was just calling out the Russians, and for what it is. I mean, that was actually quite. That was a very important, statement. For example.
An icy calm has descended in the room because someone's praised a Conservative politician.
But he is the Defence Secretary.
But I would like to endorse it. I think it's been absolutely commendable. There's a huge amount of expertise in the audience. I see ex-ambassadors, people who've written books, people who've reported, people who've been expelled from Russia. Yeah. I'm dying to get some questions.
The people who are living this, right now, including our Ukrainian colleagues with all of their families. I mean, this is not just an intellectual discussion.
I'm very keen to get some questions, but I just want to approach the subject from 90 degrees, because your book actually isn't just about Russia. It's also about class, sex, race, the different sorts
Gender,
of...
he means, by the way.
No,
although that might sell the book better if it was about something else.
Sex and gender. But I just want you just to give us a brief account of in a way, which is the sort of central message of that part of the book, about how crippled Britain is by its system of social class, and how very different that was in America. Although, on the other hand, there were some other things that was quite bad in America, which were much more relaxed over here. So. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, class is subsumed in the United States by race as well. I mean, there's a class dimension to all kinds of different things. But it's also regionalism that I'm talking about in the book, because I think since I left the United Kingdom in 1989 to go to the United States, a lot of things have changed here, but the regional divides in the United Kingdom have not. And that's also this case in the United States. And so, coming from where I did in the northeast of England, growing up in the 70s and 1980s, at a time of massive dislocation and deindustrialization. Look, I think a lot of people here forget that the north of England was dominated by nationalized industries. I didn't know anybody who worked in the private sector when I was growing up, apart from the people who owned the corner shop. The doctors, kind of nurses. My mother was a nurse, worked in the National Health Service. Everybody worked for British Rail, British Steel, British Coal. Now, why was it all nationalised? Because it was unprofitable after World War II. We'd been, the country had been laid waste. Remember rationing? Well, some of you might remember, but rationing went on until 1957. I don't remember that, but my parents and my grandparents were always talking about it. Britain had a really hard time rebuilding itself after the war. And in the north of England, everybody was dominated by the major nationalised heavy industries. And so everyone was working class in the environment I grew up in. And then when, basically, obviously the coal mines started to close, much earlier than the 70s and 80s, 1960s, my father was a coal miner, lost his job over and over again because all of the local pits closed. You just moved from one to the next, however far you could walk or bicycle. Nobody had a car. I didn't know anybody with a car, mostly growing up as well. And certainly in my family, although neighbours and friends had them, it made it extraordinarily difficult to find a job. And, in my hometown, after 1979, when Margaret Thatcher comes in and there's the mass privatisation, everybody loses their job at once. And the bottom falls out of these towns, the tax base disappears. The schools start to fail because there's not resources. And people, they're competing for a minuscule number of jobs. My father was actually lucky because the mines that he worked in closed early enough that he got a job as a hospital porter in the local hospital, and every porter was a miner because they didn't have resumes. They used to have people vouch for them for a job, and so they're only capable of basically doing manual labour because they have nothing else. They have no other skills, and the whole experience of growing up in that environment, seeing how wrenching it was, and the fact that no other industry comes in and people don't have the wherewithal to move, they don't have the qualifications, the education system is all geared towards the nationalised industries. What startled me was seeing the same thing in the United States, but also in Russia and the Soviet Union. And when I went to the Soviet Union, I thought, gosh, it's just like home. And it's one big, giant nationalised industry with central planning. And all the shops were boarded up, or rather, they were empty. At home, they were boarded up because there was no demand, because nobody had any money. In the Soviet Union, there was nothing in the shops because central planning had broken down, and there was demand, but there was nothing there. I remember, once when I was a student there, going into the shop next door, which was supposed to sell Hungarian goods, Balaton. It was supposed to be a kind of a shop filled with delicacies, and all it had was a huge array of Hungarian women's boots that obviously just kind of come in one great big huge container or something. They were all in one size, my size. I bought 10 pairs and started thinking, I could just wear these boots the rest of my life. This is kind of amazing. But then I thought about it. This is a bit bizarre, isn't it? There's just, kind of one pair of boots in this shop. And this was, kind of the part of the problem. And it all just seemed very familiar. Yeah. And then when I'm working in Russia, when, I kind of actually, in fact, we met back in the 1990s when you were covering all of this, as a journalist, with privatization and shock therapy. The whole of Russia fell into the same hole that on a much smaller scale the north of England had fallen into. And people lost their jobs, their identities, their sort of sense of self, and Putin fed on that grievances. When he comes in to power as president in 1999, he basically says, I'm going to make Russia great again. And first of all, I was going to fix the economy, and then, of course, he gets the sort of imperial ambitions that we're talking about. But when I got to the United States and Harvard, of all things, in 1989 as scholarship, I noticed if I stepped outside of Harvard Yard and went to places like Somerville and Medford, that had been the centre of car manufacturing and meat packing plants and brickworks, they were all closed down as well. And all the people I met out of there who weren't at Harvard, the people who were working in the kitchens and the custodial jobs, they'd all used to have great jobs in the car factories, and they didn't have them anymore either. And the whole northeast of the United States was in this flux. It eventually recovers. But when you go to the Midwest, it didn't used to be called the Rust Belt. This was the heartland of American industry, and the same thing's happening. And the political consequences are evident. My hometown in the north of England, Bishop Auckland, voted overwhelmingly for Brexit because they kind of believed that that would bring funding to the town. Hasn't particularly yet. They, can completely change in, the last election and vote for a Tory MP after 100 years of voting for Labour, originally for the Liberals, but then they kind of moved to the Labour Party. Again, because they're kind of still wondering and hoping that somebody's going to do something. And if you think about what happened in the United States, in the 2016 election, Trump wins the election by 70,000 votes in the Electoral College, of course not in the popular vote. And they come from 3 counties in 3 states in the Rust Belt, in Appalachia and the places that have lost all of their industry and all of their jobs. And Putin, his entire base is the old Soviet Rust Belt. And why does Donbass become so much of a focal point, a flashpoint? Because Donbass was the old steel and coal area of what's now Ukraine, but in the old Soviet period. And County Durham, my home county, was twinned with Donbass going back to the 1920s. In fact, some of the deep mines in Donbass were basically created by Welsh miners, Scottish miners, and miners from County Durham. And when I was recently at home, one of the representatives of the Durham Miners Association showed me a book of the 1920s from a delegation of Durham miners and their wives, including this really formidable miner's wife. This is the 20s, kind of when women had only just got the vote. And the miners still didn't, there wasn't a miners' union. This was Durham Miners Association. They went off to the Donbass to see how they were doing things there. This Councillor, Mrs. Errington. And, they have all of these incredible pictures of these, what were really a showcase coal mine in Donbass. It's like pretty pristine, not at all like coal mines in County Durham at the time. But there's these long threads and these, long connections. And all of these places are bound together because of the disappearance of opportunity.
And of course, the I think you call them the left behind regions, both weaken the kind of cohesion of Western society and make us less able to stand up to Putin, as we're seeing in France at the moment, where Marine Le Pen is, who may, could yet win.
And she's playing with the same constituency.
Playing the same constituency.
That's right.
And it also gives votes for the sort of strongmen like Trump who might come back again. And I just wondered, perhaps before we go into questions, my final sort of cheerful thought, after so many cheerful thoughts we've had already, is what happens if we get Trump again in 2 years? Is that curtains for the Atlantic Alliance, end of NATO? Do we then, Europe has to look after security on its own, or will we stagger through thanks to some more heroic Fiona Hill type people in the White House, or keep the show on the road?
I wouldn't bet on that last point, because I think an awful lot of people will balk at the idea, going in again. I mean, it would then be very much dependent on, particularly when it thinks about the transatlantic alliance, about really what Congress thinks about that. We have to actually remember that there actually is a huge support in Congress, bipartisan support for NATO and for the transatlantic alliance, notwithstanding a lot of the politicking and the kind of partisan back and forth you kind of see in the kind of public arena, and the many people here who I think would endorse that. But I do think that it sounds the death knell for Western democracy. And let me explain why. Look, because Trump could very easily win, and he could win again very easily in the Electoral College. And how many times then is an American election decided in the Electoral College and not in the larger, basically popular vote? And then you have to kind of ask about the feelings of disenfranchisement for millions of people who voted in a different way because of the arcane 18th century nature of the system. There's an awful lot of debate about this, and we know a few things about arcane 18th century politics here as well. But there is a kind of a different system for this, and the American presidency is a kind of a referendum. We all know how referendums go. They can sometimes not go in the way that people think. It's a beauty contest as well. It's about when I've asked some of my American nephews, who would voted for Trump, why did you vote? Some of the other guy's boring. I mean, it's because it's kind of, the excitement, the charisma, the kind of interest. It's not about, the issues, because, kind of people, because that's kind of what happens in a referendum and when you're having a system like this. But from the outside, people will look at this and think, what? The Americans have done this again? And, so what about their electoral system? And also, if Trump, wins in the popular vote, and he wins on the back of, having already said that he didn't lose the last election on the big lie, and the fact that, millions of people believe that the last election was stolen by Joe Biden, and we had the insurrection of January 6th, and the commission, the committee for January 6th that is still underway, have basically unearthed so much information showing how close the United States came to effectively having a coup by Trump, a self-coup, and him still being in power. This will be the kind of the death knell, I think, of a Western democracy, because there'll be a lot of people out there thinking, well, I could do this then, couldn't I, as well? Who needs term limits, and, who needs to kind of basically abide by the rules? And all of, the countries that have had delegations from the United States and elsewhere, giving them advice on how to run their electoral systems, will look at this and think, well, what's the point?
When I'm on the
anyway, exactly.
My standard pitch on the doorstep, which is when people say, "What are you doing?" I say, "I'm trying to save democracy one doorbell at a time." And I do think, actually, seriously, that basic business of talking to voters starts rebuilding the sort of trust in the system. And I also feel incredibly lucky that we are in a country where, however much we may dislike the ruling party on a council or something, it never crosses our minds that they would try and miscount the votes. We just take that absolutely for granted. So I think we're going to move on to some questions from you in the audience. I see Owen Bennett-Jones, familiar to many listeners of the World Service, is there. We have a roving microphone. I'm going to share the microphone with you.
Very good.
And let's have Owen at the back. No, for the people watching on live stream, you need to have the microphone.
All right.
Thank you very much. There may be a very short answer to this, but I was just wondering if you became aware in your work with the US government of US officials suggesting that the Russians' manipulation of the 2016 election extended beyond stolen emails and social media activity to trying to get into the vote counting machines to change the numbers of votes that were cast by American voters?
We saw no evidence that they were able to change votes.
Or tried to?
Well, we can see evidence that they tried to penetrate the systems, and in a way, I think they were trying to signal that they were doing this to raise exactly these kinds of questions. Because the whole purpose of the intervention in 2016 was to cast doubt on the outcome. And, we know that Putin did this as revenge for what he thought happened in 2011, 2012, when he returned to the presidency, sidelining Dmitry Medvedev. He thought Hillary Clinton and the State Department had somehow fomented and then paid for the protests against him in Moscow and St. Petersburg and elsewhere. He was convinced that our efforts through things like IFES, the International Federation, I'm getting this wrong, aren't I, the acronym of electoral systems, or the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, and all of the activities that we were doing for transparency and getting out the vote was somehow all intended to undermine him in some respect. And he wanted to push it all right back at us. He wanted to kind of suggest that the US presidential election was also illegitimate. And so, in many respects, this was for demonstration effect, so that people would actually ask that question and wonder and worry about it.
And it's interesting, the only actually demonstrated, proven Russian interference in the British electoral system was an attempt to make people think that the Scottish independent referendum had been rigged. And Russian video channels were putting doctored pictures of piles of votes being moved around, claiming that the London authorities were depriving the Scottish people of their democratic will. And this was an election that had been observed by the Scottish nationalists who'd found absolutely no fault at any point in the counts. It was obviously absurd. But if you look at the Electoral Commission report for the Scottish referendum, you see that they do actually say that there was, for the first time, there was some concern among the electorate that the votes hadn't been properly counted. And that was a clear win for the Russians. Let's have hundreds and hundreds of questions. I'm just going to work my way around the room going this way. So go ahead, sir. Yes. And if you wanted to introduce yourself, that would be fine too.
Hi, I'm Mayo. We've talked before. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for your work. I was just wondering to what extent you think the invasion of Ukraine signifies a serious return to the logic of spheres of influence.
Well, I think, from Putin's perspective, spheres of influence have never gone away. So, from this is him, trying to basically make this a fact on the ground. So, just a little, vignette from my time in government at the National Security Council. With a crisis in Venezuela, when Nicolas Maduro lost the election but decided he was going to stay on, and then the United Kingdom, the United States, and many other European countries were trying to push for Juan Guaido and others to be able to take their place as a sort of provisional government. You may remember that there was kind of a little bit of an incident where the Russians sort of decided that maybe the United States might be moving in perhaps from Colombia, instead of it being a humanitarian operation to help the Venezuelans, deal with some of the kind of consequences that maybe the US might move in. And so they sent in 100 guys on a plane, all the kind of guys who pulled off the dirty tricks in the elections, for example, to try to help Maduro push back. And then we started getting all these kind of signals from the Russians behind the scenes in the way that they always do. They have think tank people talk about it, and various people make comments that they then, kind of to journalists and things about maybe a swap between Venezuela and Ukraine. We're now in your neighborhood, and, kind of maybe you'd like to get out of ours. And I was actually sent over to Russia in April of 2019 to push back against this. And, it was basically, the whole point was, kind of, well, you had the Monroe Doctrine, you have, these sort of spheres of influence. We were kind of trying to say, look, Venezuela isn't in our sphere of influence. We have a lot of Venezuelans living in the United States, particularly in Miami. So yes, there is a kind of, a major political element, but it's not that you would say Venezuelans come to us rather than, the kind of the other way around, and trying to explain to them, look, we're just not in this game anymore. Because President Trump, for all the things that, people think about him, he wasn't in when he was thinking about real estate. He just wanted to build a building. He didn't want to acquire the entire country, with it. Trump Tower in Moscow, or Trump Tower, in New York, obviously, but, Trump Tower in Istanbul. It wasn't like he wanted to acquire Turkey or Russia. He just wanted to build a flashy building. And we kept, trying to explain to the Russians that we're just not doing that anymore, and they would not believe it. They basically, no, we're still in the geopolitical game. No, we're not. We're not going to have a new Yalta and Potsdam and sit down, and Churchill's not going to pull out of this pocket another, you take this and I'll take that. But they were still trying it. And this is, really what Putin's about. He wants to show, yes, there are spheres of influence. And Ukraine should not just be in our sphere of influence, but Ukraine should be, part, again, of this Russian imperium.
Thomas.
Yeah. Hi, Thomas from Highgate. A lot of the people fighting in the army of the Russian Federation happen actually not to be Russians, yes. But coming from North Caucasus or other areas of the Russian Federation in what is still actually a kind of an empire. So as the body bags are piling up back home, do you think that there's a risk of instability and collapse of the Russian Federation that would echo what happened in 1991, because there's still a lot of resentment in some areas of the Russian Federation vis-à-vis Moscow that is perceived as still being a colonial power within the Federation?
This is really an important point, Thomas, and it's something that a lot of people are looking at very closely, including quite a few Russian commentators who are worrying themselves about, the potential disintegration of the Russian Federation. And we were already getting a lot of evidence that from the North Caucasus, where it's kind of traditionally been this kind of pipeline of young men being sent into the Russian military, they want to get training under normal circumstances, and it's kind of a ladder of mobility. In the old days, they were probably sent on construction brigades somewhere else outside of the North Caucasus, Dagestan, Chechnya, places like this. That the kind of military was a way of kind of moving forward. Well, now it's a move, straight into carnage. And into being, the proverbial cannon fodder. And there is, notwithstanding all the stories about Ramzan Kadyrov and the Kadyrovtsi, kind of fighting for Russia and Ukraine, something of great reluctance now, particularly as the next cycle of conscription comes up, for people to be stepping forward. Also, this is part of the strategy to send non-ethnic Russians to Ukraine. Because part of it is the idea then that there won't be that feeling of affinity, with the Ukrainians. And also, just as you said, to kind of mask the losses. But those have not been masked. We've had the sinking of the Moskva, the major flagship of the Russian Navy. We've also had the wiping out in certain battles of airborne divisions. So County Durham is also twinned with Kostroma in the Yaroslavl region of Russia. And they have one of the major airborne divisions there. And it seems that an awful lot of people have died. In fact, when I was back at home in County Durham a week or so ago, I was talking to some of the people involved in the exchanges, and they themselves are anecdotally picking up people that they've been in contact with the loss of their children and their grandchildren, and all this, and a backlash emerging in the regions. Because this is exactly the problem they had in Afghanistan, exactly the problem they had with Chechnya back in the 1990s. And there is, of course, great concern on the part of the Kremlin that there will start to be that backlash. It's why they went after Memorial, and closed it down beforehand after the Soldiers' Mothers Committee, pushing out an awful lot of people.
We should just explain probably for that Memorial is the main NGO dealing with the crimes and lies of the Stalin era.
Exactly. Yeah, sorry to just kind of make generally that assumption that everybody would immediately know what that is. But precisely because of this fear that casualties in wartime could create a backlash. But again, it also is the point that they didn't expect this. And so we are now in a very uncertain period, and I think it's something we watch closely, but it's hard to basically derive from that a kind of prediction about where we're going to be.
John Snow, so I'm breaking the rules here because I see, wait for the microphone, as you should know.
How paranoid is Putin, and the vast distance between himself and the minister to whom he was speaking, sitting at one end of the table, which was, I think, a full cricket pitch. 22 yards.
Yeah. So I've actually been at that table, and I think a few of other people in this room might have done that big white table in the big room like this. And it doesn't seem that large when there's no large number of people at it, but it looks pretty ridiculous when you've got Putin at one end and Macron and others at the other. And yes, it's a mixture of paranoia, but also, when you start to think about the iconography of that, the kind of image making, for Putin, I think he thinks that basically showed power. Yeah. And, we look at it and we think, this is nuts. Man's bonkers. Why is he, we know he's a germaphobe. Is it really, 6 feet? Is that enough? 60 feet? And that seems like, maybe a little bit too much here. But I think it's meant to show that he's really in charge and that people are coming to play court to him and that they kind of kept at an arm's length and a distance. And that's kind of part of this, symbolism that he's projecting here. I've seen that, in action myself. But look, getting to that point of paranoia, absolutely he's paranoid. We know that, after 2011, after the Arab Spring and all the uprisings, he could not figure out how the United States or anybody else, for example, would let Mubarak be kicked out in Egypt and end up in jail. Particularly, everyone knew Mubarak, from the past, and he thought, well, isn't he close to the United States? The killing of Gaddafi, when he was captured. Putin reportedly, and I think it's some good authority, watched that video over and over and over again. He has said publicly many times that he knows exactly what happens when you're on the losing side. You get put against the wall and shot. Obviously thinking about Ceausescu, Hitler in the bunker, Mussolini and the partisans and the lamppost. And Putin knows how this plays out, and he wants to make sure that it does not happen to him. And look, that is why he interceded in Syria on behalf of Assad in 2015, to make sure that al-Assad did not go down the Gaddafi path. And Putin is quite happy to still be standing there amidst all of the rubble and the carnage of other people suffering, precisely because he does not want this to happen to him.
We've only got 50 minutes left, so we're going to have some quick-fire questions.
And shorter answers.
And very short answers. The lady over there, who's had her hand up since the beginning, and I'll take 2 or 3 together, I think.
Thank you very much. Olesa Kromachuk, I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. Thanks for your excellent discussion. Ukraine has just started to appear on the mental map of the world. A little bit late, but I spent the last 5 weeks explaining to journalists the difference between Russia and Ukraine, because that's what they wanted to know, to my surprise. Better late than never, I suppose. But the question to you is, what would you say is the most efficient way to explain to the world, and not just the collective West, the knowledge that exists in Ukraine is vital for us all over the world, not just that Ukraine is a breadbasket of the world, but also that there are resistance strategies in Ukraine, anti-colonial, anti-imperial resistance strategies, the understanding of a political nation that perhaps is worth learning about, and so on. It's still perceived as a small nation of 40 million, even though it's the largest state in Europe. Just be great to hear your opinion.
Well, I think getting out there and telling these stories just as you've done it. I think we'd send you on the road to do public diplomacy. I think there is a great quote from Lucien Kim, who used to be the head of the National Public Radio Bureau in Moscow. And Lucien wrote a piece for the Kennan Institute recently, and it's just a great quote that Ukrainians are citizens of their country, while Russians remain the subjects of their ruler. And I think, basically what Ukrainians are us. It's basically a highly networked, sophisticated community of people who are full citizens in every sense of that word, who have agency and are not dependent on one person. And I think that is a kind of a message. It is the post-colonial message. You know, for the rest of the world, I think, look, Ghana gets it, Kenya gets it. You know, we've heard that from the United Nations. And I think Ukrainians, you have to go out there and be your best advocates. You know, it's kind of, you know, guilt by association of hanging out with the Brits and the Americans and others, you know, for a while, getting out and, you know, explaining that Ukrainians have been giving aid to the world, not just as the kind of breadbasket of Europe, but, you know, Ukrainian pilots were doing a lot of the humanitarian relief in Africa. Everywhere you turn, it would be a Ukrainian pilot assisting, you know, the kind of world and reminding people of the things that Ukraine has contributed in that way as well.
Nicholas Beale in the front row, and then Susan Greenberg.
Yeah.
We have quick questions and then one answer at the end.
I know a bit about China, almost nothing about Russia. And I wonder if you might be a little bit pessimistic about China. My sense is that they are really pissed off with the way things are going. You know, they don't really care about the rest of the world like any big country. They don't like economic problems. They don't like energy prices going up. They definitely don't like it being shown that amphibious invasions aren't a good thing. Don't you think that there's a little bit more hope that China can act wisely in this? Because they do seem to be the one nation that Putin's genuinely worried about for good reason.
Right, and then Susan Greenberg, sit your hand.
Hello. Before I ask my question, I just want to say to Fiona Hill that I knew you were very knowledgeable and interesting, but I didn't realize how funny you were as well. So I just wonder whether, is there, on a positive note, is there a real opportunity over all of this conflict to renew the effort to discuss and explore and educate the general public about the importance of democracy? Because I've been quite shocked over the years at how little people know or care or are aware of the issues. And we talk about left and right, but really the key division is between totalitarian and democratic.
Thanks so much, Susan. And then Christopher Peters.
Yeah, that's very good.
And I love that. I've been thinking about the spirit of 1863 breaking out all over again. Christopher.
Fiona, you talk in your book about your trajectory, your career path. I was wondering if you ever met your Russian counterparts and got a sense of their career path and what they thought, and if it differed from the official line, what that might tell us, if anything.
Gosh, three super questions.
Question. Yeah. Well, look, with China, I think an awful lot of us are maybe engaging in that kind of same hope, wishful thinking. A lot of my China, I know I do this as well, but then my colleagues who are China experts, you know, always then dispel my hopes and, you know, basically cautioning that, of course, you know, China doesn't really want the West to be united again, and is really very worried about all of the things that you've laid out there. And so, you know, they can't really also afford to see Putin defeated. You know, they want Putin also to be able to declare victory. And they are also not particularly thrilled by the way that, you know, we have responded, because it's showing also, you know, the dangers of having invested so much in, you know, the rest of the world, particularly putting your bank reserves for your central bank in other places, and just the ways in which things can go wrong. However, you know, perhaps if Ukraine can engage directly with Chinese in their public diplomacy, there are some other messages here. I mean, I don't want to kind of create, you know, more frictions with Japan, for example, but Ukraine itself was subject to brutal colonialism and occupation during World War II. Well, the things that we're seeing in Mariupol and Bichar and Irpin, the rape of Nanjing. And China itself, within the United Nations system, made a great deal about the importance of territorial integrity and independence and sovereignty. That's why the claims to Taiwan are really very important. And China was the single largest country investor in Ukraine. China's got nothing against Ukraine in the slightest. And there was also talk about, you know, investing in agriculture in Ukraine because of, you know, the risk of famine and, you know, kind of problems in China as well. So I think Ukrainians need to engage with China directly, but knowing full well that, you know, there is still, they've made such an investment in Russia. I mean, that statement about a partnership with no limits on February 4th, I was shocked by that. I didn't expect that the Chinese would go all in like that. Did they really know, you know, what Putin was going to do on February 24th? Or did they think they'd be in and out and this would all be over and, you know, they would be kind of reaping some of the spoils of this as well? Because China suddenly made itself an antagonist to NATO and to Europe as well. And in a way, they're now part of our security dilemma, not just, part of our economic and political dilemmas. And I think, that needs to be made clear too, maybe to push them in a different direction. In terms of, what you just said about an opportunity for the renewal of democracy, I think absolutely. And, I know that, Ed is running for office, as hopefully a member of parliament and, for particular the Liberal Democratic Party, but look, we can all be politically engaged. And I think that is also the message from this as well. I just want to say that irrespective of party and, kind of position, what Ukraine is showing us here is that this incredible civic engagement under duress, because everybody individually is doing something here, irrespective of what their background is. And I think that that's, what democracy is all about. I was just walked past, the BBC today, and there's the statue of George Orwell, which I'd never noticed before, actually, and talking about what liberty and democracy is, basically the freedom to be able to tell people the things they don't want to hear. Well, Ukraine is telling a lot of people things that they don't want to hear. And, you're telling people, have been for a very long time, people, things that they didn't want to hear. And this is the kind of an essence of all of this, having a big debate, having a discussion about all of these critical issues, and knowing that each one of us in here can do something. And I think that that's kind of an important, and reviving that and getting people to be civically active in their communities, running to be members of parliament, engaged in political parties, but thinking about how we can all kind of do something collectively is pretty vital, and that's what democracy is about.
Well, you can certainly come back here.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the Russian counterpart, it's kind of weird because, in many respects, this, again, given everything that I've said there, the old Communist Party allowed people to move up, through the hierarchy in ways that the contemporary Russia doesn't. So you think about people like Khrushchev, for example. Khrushchev was a miner. I mean, he wasn't from Ukraine, but, he worked in the mines, kind of the whole Donbass, kind of all the things for, Khrushchev. People like Gorbachev coming from, a rural area in the, Stavropol and the southern parts of Russia. And there was women, kind of who one could have spoken about. There was quotas, admittedly, but there was kind of an expansion of, women who were, able to rise up in the old Soviet and communist system. And in modern Russia, that's actually become quite difficult. I mean, the most prominent woman was just being sanctioned, Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank. But very few, women in politics, very few women being outspoken. My friend and actually classmate at Harvard in a PhD program, Evgeny Albats, just an incredible, person, but being a kind of a critic and outside and probably, under some, great jeopardy now. But one of the bravest women in Russia. I mean, certainly braver than anything that I or anybody else, because I'm done here in the way that she's still speaking out. But the contemporary Russian system has made it actually very difficult, also for the same sorts of reasons, for people, to move ahead and to do the kinds of, things that, I and others here have done. And it was easier, ironically, in the Soviet period.
I think the quality of Russian officials has been going down and down, and kleptocracy is sort of antithetical to meritocracy, and good positions are bought rather than acquired through merit. Right, I'm going to have a brisk whiz round. I think
I'm making a quick note of that.
Okay, so John McGrory, and then gentleman here who's been incredibly patient, and then here.
Thanks very much, Ed. A comparison has been made between, perhaps a superficial comparison, between Hitler and Putin. Now, Hitler, one understands in that he was a great orator and charismatic and triumph of the will and all of that, and he was very much in control of Nazi Germany. What I don't understand about Putin is that he doesn't seem to project a personality. He comes across as this rather chubby-faced little man who doesn't seem at all problematic. Is he, from your intelligence, for your understanding, is he actually the fellow who's completely in charge? Is he a strong, iron-willed fellow, rather like Hitler was, rather like Stalin was? Or is he just a puppet? Is there some group who's actually running the show in Russia, and how do we challenge that? We need to know that if we're going to challenge it, don't we?
Right. And then gentleman here who had his hand up at the very beginning and has been patient ever since.
Robert Grant, Wilton Park. What could a Putin succession look like? Say he dies of illness, for example, over, sometime in the next several years. And is there any hope for a pathway back to better relations under a Putin successor regime?
Okay, and then just over here, and then we'll have telegraphic answers.
I'm Conrad Quilty-Harper from Bloomberg UK. Could you rate the British government's performance over this crisis? There's quite a lot of people who aren't on sanctioned lists, and there's long lists that are very public.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, the two questions, related to Putin, is he a puppet, is he really in charge, and Putin's succession are linked together, actually. Look, we know, for example, that this war is very much a war of Putin's choice that was kind of planned with just a couple of other people, maybe 2 or 3, 4 at the most. It's pretty evident, and we know that from other means, let's just say. And, Putin has been extremely effective in the way that Stalin was, of playing people off against each other and making himself the arbiter of the system over time. Look, he's been in power for 22 years. Also, there are a lot of people who are vested in him, just like there was in Nazi Germany, a whole system, that has emerged around him. About 60% of the Russian workforce is dependent on the state one way or another, in the bureaucracy and state-dominated companies, working for the Kremlin one way or another. It's a vast machine. And so there's an awful lot of people who are believing in Putin because they want to believe in Putin, and they elevate him there because he's kind of like the linchpin in the system. Now, is he in complete control of everything? Nobody's in complete control of everything. We kind of know from the way that the war has gone that there's all kinds of information that he obviously didn't have, or that he misread, or that he didn't, kind of pay attention to. And this gets into the, the issue of succession. Putin was, of course, as you well know, selected by Boris Yeltsin, and a group of people around Boris Yeltsin who thought that they could control Putin, that it could turn him into their puppet, and he turned out to be, actually quite wily and quite adept at playing them off against each other. Putin has always said that his speciality was dealing with people, which meant blackmailing them, kind of manipulating them, being very careful about what he told one person over another person, and, building relationships with people. There's all kinds of stories about Putin that are very interesting that show just how very carefully he hid his true intentions and, led people to think he was doing one thing over another. And it looked like, at an earlier period, that Putin himself was looking for his successor. Look, he tried out Dmitry Medvedev for a while, didn't like what Dima, as he would put it, was up to, decided to kind of pull him back and step back in. And one of the reasons that he changed the constitution in 2020 to potentially stay in power to 2036 is because the obviously Operation Successor wasn't working too well. Because in the Russian system, if you kind of let people think that you're going to go somewhere, there's lots of other people who would like that position, and they might hurry you along. Russia has a whole history of palace coups and, as we know, kind of unfortunate assassinations. Putin's been doing some of these himself. And he wanted to make sure not just that he was not a lame duck, but not a dead duck. So basically, Putin wanted to give himself more time. And as you're suggesting here, what if he's ill? I mean, he's become the wild card in the system. Now, it wasn't to say that it would, completely throw things out of whack. There is, a succession plan in terms of the, in case of emergency, break glass, pull this lever. You get, the prime minister or the speaker of the Russian parliament, and then you're supposed to get an election. But it does start to have, shades of Death of Stalin, the movie. One of the reasons that Putin didn't want it to be shown, because, that great, kind of Steve Buscemi, everybody running around everywhere, running into each other, killing the Stalin stand-ins, and, kind of general wondering who's going to, do what with whom. There could be some elements of this. But Putin might not care because he'll be dead, he'll be out of there, and people are starting to worry that, is his succession plan. Mm-hmm. And then it will be, something of a free-for-all, and it gets more likely back to, the kind of question, is he a puppet, is he in charge? There's a lot of hard men around him. In a wartime scenario, martial law, somebody else kind of emerging from the system, maybe not Shoigu, because he seems to have had a bit of a problem, kind of conducting the war, but maybe Bortnikov or, one of the other people from the security services stepping in. So, it doesn't look particularly promising. The one person who wants to be president, Alexei Navalny, who's, said this quite openly, is now sitting in a penal colony. So the system itself is, trying to certainly, make sure that they know who is coming in next.
I think one thing one can confidently predict is that when there is a succession, the outside world will get it wrong. And I would draw your attention to the Times coverage in 1953, and I speak as a Times columnist, when Stalin died. and the Times leader bemoaned the danger of hardliners taking over.
Yeah, I know. Yes, so it's good. Look, I mean, all kinds of things can happen. We got Gorbachev.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting, just like you said, we got Khrushchev. So all kinds of unexpected trajectories can emerge
Just very
in here.
quick, on a scale of
yes,
1 to 10.
on the scale of 1 to 10, yeah, I'd give it about 5 or 6 actually. But I'll just explain why. I mean, I already gave Ben Wallace some praise because I do think that was important. I think, moving very quickly on getting weapons to Ukrainian, not very good on visas, let's just say, and some of the handling of things. And I think absolutely a heck of a lot more work to be done. But the big key is it's not dependent on one person. It shouldn't be dependent on one political party. We have to be in here for the long haul. So it should be, okay, the British government is one thing, but what about Britain, writ large, people like yourselves? How are we going to be managing this over the longer period of time? It's going to be incumbent, getting back to my point about agency, on all of us, in the US, in the UK and elsewhere, to realise that this is something that we have to commit to. We have to commit to, helping Ukraine for the long haul. And so we have a lot more work to be done.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. You can sit down.
Fiona, thank you so much. I think I speak for everyone when I say I feel blessed to have spent the last hour and a quarter in your presence. It's just so much has been covered. Edward, thank you so much. And there are many people around this room to thank, including the people who gave the fabulous questions, illuminating as they were. The team, starting with Constance, if you'd stand up, please. And Constance's family for managing microphones. Andrea, who does an invisible but fabulous job. Rebecca, our organizer, hiding behind the columns. The digital team, Martha and Christopher. And many others who've made this possible. A reminder, if you need it, and I doubt you do, that there's an opportunity to buy Fiona's book and have it signed by Fiona if you act quickly. And a reminder also that this is a fundraising event. We've had a call to democratic action, to embracing democracy. This is the way to do it, to support a really fabulous candidate for election to our parliament, and to get involved, not just financially. Donations are hugely welcome. Tories have money, we don't have as much. Please do give, but also to be involved in the democratic process on the doorstep, involving people you know, your network. Please do get involved. Thank you so much for coming.